Alright, so picking up exactly where I left off in the last video, we saw the two comparison renders here with no global illumination before and then the after with global illumination. So let me go ahead and close this one here and just keep the render frame window. Okay, before we continue any further, I want to explain something here. There's two ways that you can work with global illumination. There's the easy way and the hard way. The easy way is using the automatic mode. Automatic mode is on by default. It makes it very easy and very fast to work with global illumination. You don't have to be a long time rendering expert with Mental Ray to use the automatic mode. We're going to focus on automatic mode for now. Later on in the tutorial, we're going to get into the manual mode and you'll get to see how that works. I consider it to be pretty important to work with the manual mode. If you're able to work with the manual mode, you'll be more capable of tackling difficult projects and taking care of problems when they come down the pipe in a production. Okay, so it's very important for you to know, so I felt it necessary to teach you the manual mode, so that's going to be included in this tutorial. But for now, we're going to go ahead and rely on automatic mode since it's the easiest way to get up and running with global illumination. Okay. There's two main areas where you can control the global illumination here in our scene. Okay, one of the areas is with the light settings itself. The settings of the individual lights in your scene have parameters that control global illumination. The other place where you can find parameters for global illumination is in the render setup window, and we'll look at that in a moment. Okay, so let's go ahead and close this render frame window here. Right here in the parameters here, the modify panel of the sky of the portal light here. If we go down here, we have a section here for Mental Ray indirect illumination. Let me go ahead and close all of the rollouts because we don't need them all open right now and it just looks confusing. Here you have a Mental Ray indirect illumination rollout. Let's open that one up. There aren't really a lot of settings to change here, but the settings that are here are very important for controlling global illumination. They can control the speed at which global illumination renders, and they also control the quality. So it's very important to understand how these settings work. At the top, we have the automatic controls, and you can see that they're on by default. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, automatic mode is on by default when working with global illumination in 3ds Max. Down here, we can see that there's some parameters that are grayed out, and we actually can't interact with them that are turned off. These are the manual settings. We'll talk about how to work with these manual settings in another chapter. Right now we're going to focus on these top settings up here. So these global multipliers control three main settings here with the light. They control the energy, which translates to the brightness of the global illumination, and they also control the caustic and GI photons. What's the difference between caustic and GI photons? Well, we're going to talk about caustic photons in another chapter in this tutorial a little bit later. We're not going to focus on that now. Very quickly, caustic photons are basically the specular indirect illumination that happens when light passes through some kind of transparent or specular reflective surface. Say, for example, when you're looking at the bottom of a pool on a hot sunny day from the top, you can see those little caustic effects of the light shimmering at the bottom of the pool. That's a caustic effect. The caustic effect can also be seen if you're outside in the bright day and you have, say, a bottle of soda or a bottle of water sitting on the ground. You'll notice that there's this strange caustic light that appears that reflects on the ground, on the concrete or on a table. And we'll talk about this later. We're not going to worry about this now. The GI photons is what we're interested in here. GI stands for global illumination. These are the photons that come from the light. They're emitted from this light source. They bounce around in our scene like photons do in real life. Okay? So this is one place where we can control that. The multiplier here controls how many photons are going to be used in our scene. The more photons you have, the higher quality the global illumination result is going to be, but the longer it's going to take to render. So keep that in mind. Let's go ahead and let's have a look at the render setup window here. Let's go to rendering, render setup, indirect illumination tab. Make sure you're in caustics and global illumination. We're going to deal with global illumination down here. So here are the settings down here. Okay, we have a multiplier setting that controls the brightness of the photons. We also have a color swatch, and if we click on that little color box right there, we open up the color selector here, and we can actually give the photons in the scene a specific color. Let's see how this works. Let's go ahead and do a render here. And this is what we have. Let me just move that off to the side. Bring the render setup window here. Okay. If I go ahead and take this multiplier and increase it to say something like 5, and I render this out again, you notice that the global illumination is now much, much brighter. So our scene is super bright here. It's actually being blown out of proportion. Okay, let me go back to 1. I can also change the color of these photons. Say, for example, if I wanted red photons, I could choose a red color. I can render this out again. And now you notice the global illumination has this reddish hue to it. It doesn't look realistic. It's actually a pretty fake effect. But the beauty of Mental Ray is that the option is there for you to do whatever it is you would like to do. Okay, so you can do realistic effects, you can do fake effects that are not realistic, and so on and so forth. Okay, let me render this out again with white color. So basically I'm back to the default. It's set to a multiplier of 1 and a color white. Okay, the next option we have down here is the maximize, or I'm sorry, the next option we have down here is the maximum number photons per sample, and it's set to a default setting of 500, which is actually a pretty decent setting, but not the best. What this does, it determines the accuracy of the photons. Now, the lower this number, the worse the quality for the photons is going to be. The higher the number, the better the quality is going to look. Okay, so let me just show you an example here. Let me knock this number down to something very, very low, to like 32. Or you know what? Let's go to 16. That's even lower. Now let's go ahead and do a little test render here. You can notice that we have a bunch of blotching. We can actually start to see the individual photons that are bouncing around in our scene. This obviously is not good. It's very heavy with artifacts and is unacceptable as a final result. Okay. Now if we take that maximum number of photons per sample, or the photon accuracy, I'm just going to call it photon accuracy from now on, and you can actually increase it. Say we increase it to 2000. And we render this out again. You notice that now we don't get all that blotching. There's a very tiny amount of blotching left in the scene. You can actually see it, but it doesn't look as bad as it did before. So that's what this setting is for, and that's what it controls. Let's go back to the default 500. The next setting down here is the maximum sampling radius. This is turned off by default. Okay. Maximum sampling radius actually controls the radius at which photons are collected and sampled by Mental Ray. I know that sounds kind of crazy. What does that mean? Well, the option has 2 modes. On automatic mode or manual mode. By default, it's set to automatic mode when it's turned off. When this is turned off, Mental Ray will analyze your scene, will look at your scene, and will say, I believe the radius should be X amount. And Mental Ray will choose a suitable radius for your scene. Okay? If you don't want Mental Ray controlling that automatically, you can turn the option on, and then you can manually input your own numbers over here on the right. So right now it's set to 1 centimeter, the maximum sampling radius. If I take that number and make it something really small, we're going to be able to see the photons in our scene. So right now it's set to 1 centimeter, and if I render this out, we can see the individual photons in our scene. That's because the photons are very, very small right now. Okay, if I take this and make it even smaller, say 0.1 centimeters, and I render this out again, now you can see the photons are so tiny, so small, it kind of looks like we've got a whole bunch of stars here in outer space. Okay, this obviously is not good, so you don't want to use a very small sampling radius. You want to use a larger one. By default, though, this option is turned off, which means that Mental Ray will choose a suitable size. Editor, at the video, there was a car in the background, starting again in 3, 2, 1. Now the default has this option turned off. So let's turn that option off. Let's render again. And now Mental Ray will actually choose a suitable size for the photons for us, which is good. Okay? But the option is always there to manually change that if you like. Down here we have a merge nearby photons option, which here you can see in parentheses says saves memory. We're going to go ahead and skip that option for now. I will be coming back to it later. I'm doing this on purpose. Just trying to move along here with some of the simpler parameters that we can see changes for now. But we will talk about this just a little bit further. Okay. Then down here we have optimize for final gather. Now I'm going to skip this as well. We are going to be using this option later. You'll just have to trust me on this one. We will come back to it later, and when we do, it's going to make a lot of sense and make you go, okay, so that's what that option is for. We'll come back to it, so don't worry about that. Then down here we have a few other options for dealing with photons in volumes. We also have some trace depth parameters here. Now these trace depth parameters determine how many times photons can bounce around in our scene, basically. Okay, So photons can have a maximum number of reflections of 10 times and a maximum number of refractions of 10 times. And they have a total depth of 10. Okay. Now the default settings of 10 for all these options are actually good. You'll rarely, if ever, have to change these options. But if you need to for whatever reason, the option is here for you to go ahead and manually adjust mental rate and change them to whatever you want. So again, the reflections deals with photons that are reflecting, coming off of reflective surfaces like mirrors or anything that's shiny and has any type of reflection to it. The refractions are going to deal with refractions, when photons have to go through some kind of a transparent medium, something like glass, like a window, or a liquid, water, something like that. Okay? Down here we have some light properties. These light properties only work when you're using the automatic global illumination mode. If you look over here in the light settings, you know how we have to automatically calculate energy and photons parameters turned on here? Well, when these options are turned on here for the light, these options are going to affect the light. If I was using manual settings down here for the light, then these options up here would not apply to my actual object here, to my scene, to my global illumination. Except for the decay. The decay always works. I'll show you this in a moment. Okay. Now, we have an average caustic photons per light parameter up here. It's set to 20,000, but you notice it's grayed out. The reason it's grayed out is because we have caustics turned off. If I go up here in the caustic section and hit enable, you notice that the option now becomes active and we can adjust it. Let's go ahead and turn caustics off. We don't need it right now. Down here we have average GI photons per light, and it's set to 20,000. What this means is that mental ray is going to go ahead and say, okay, you want the average light to emit 20,000 photons, so let's go ahead and do that. So if I have one light in my scene, I'm going to have 20,000 photons per light. So I'm going to have a total of 20,000 photons. If I had, say, 2 lights in my scene, then this parameter is telling mental ray to do 20,000 photons per light. So now I'm going to have a total of 40,000 photons, and I think you get the idea. Then, of course, down here we have decay, and decay is set to 2.0. 2.0 is just a synonym for inverse square. Remember, with the lights we have the light decay, the inverse and the inverse square light decay. Well, photons actually obey light decay. If we want to have no decay, we could set this to 0. But of course, that's not going to be very realistic, and it's not going to give us a good result, as you can see. If we set this to 1, it's going to be a linear decay, which is not very realistic, as you can see, but it does make the photons decay over distance. The best setting to use, if you're going for realism, is to use the setting of 2, which is the default. This forces the light decay to default to an inverse square fall off, or light decay of 2.0. Okay, so that's where we're going to keep it. And then finally, there's this option down here. It says all objects generate and receive GI and caustics. Turning this option on overrides the scene and tells the entire scene to use global illumination and caustics. You see, let's turn that off. All the objects in our scene right now, for example, this room, which is pretty much the only object in our scene, is set to work with global illumination. If we right-click, if we select the object, right-click, and then go to Object Properties in the quad menu, okay, and we go to the Mental Ray tab over here, we can see we have some caustics and global illumination GI options right here, okay. And here's some options. We can exclude from caustics calculations, we can exclude from GI calculations, and so on and so forth. So if we turn this option on right here that says exclude from GI calculations, this object will be ignored by global illumination. So if we go ahead and render this out, you notice that we get an error message, and Mental Ray's complaining. It's saying error. There are no global illumination generators in the scene, and there are no global illumination receivers in the scene. Just hit OK, and it'll render out without global illumination. The reason it's doing that is because if we go back to the properties of this object, we overrode the object properties and we told this object not to deal with global illumination. So let's turn that option off. We can choose for this object to generate global illumination and receive global illumination. The difference is that an object that can generate global illumination can actually take photons that hit it and bounce them off toward other objects. An object that can only receive global illumination will receive the photons, but it won't allow them to bounce off of it and go to other objects. The default settings are for objects to work with global illumination both ways. They generate and receive, which is the best setting. So let's hit OK, and let's leave it like that. So the default settings are fine. You don't have to worry about changing anything in the render setup window. I recommend not using this option that says all objects generate and receive GI encaustics, simply because at times it can override and automatically activate specific objects to use global illumination, and sometimes you may want to customize your scene and have some objects work with it, some objects not work with it. The advantage being that you can manually customize your scene in order to reduce render times. Okay, down here we have another rollout here. This is the reuse rollout, and it deals with final gather and global illumination disk caching. Okay, what does that mean? Well, we're going to go ahead and dedicate some time specifically to that later. We're not going to worry about that now. You get to see it later and see how to use it to your advantage, but just not right now. Okay, so there we go. So that's global illumination and the settings for global illumination, how we can change some of these settings around, so on and so forth. I'm going to end this video here, and we're going to continue with global illumination in the next video and continue to demystify this stuff and get into it a little bit deeper.